The botanist's name was Dr. Ellen Marsh, and she had been studying Minnesota wetland plant genetics at the University of Minnesota for 17 years. She had cataloged native aquatic species across the lake country of northern Minnesota, the rice beds and cattail margins and sedge meadows that defined the region's ecological character. She had published papers. She had testified before state committees about wetland preservation. She understood, in the professional sense, what grew in Minnesota water. She could not place what she was looking at in Nora Gale's paddles. She had come to Cass County in late August 2021 because a county extension agent named Dale Kruger had called her with something he described as an unusual situation. He had said, "There's a woman out on the Leech Lake Road who grows wild rice in paddles she built herself. And the rice doesn't look like anything I've seen in 20 years of extension work up here." She had asked, "Cultivated or harvested from the lake?" He had said, "Cultivated." She had asked, "What variety?" He had said, "That's the thing, she won't say, or can't. I'm not sure which." Ellen had driven 3 hours from the Twin Cities on a Thursday morning. She had parked at the road and had walked the path to the paddles, 4 rectangular waterbeds that Nora had built into a low area behind the house, fed by a seasonal creek that ran clear and cold off the ridge. The paddles were hand-built, the dike walls of compacted clay and local rock, the water level controlled by simple wooden gates. Nothing complicated, everything functional. The kind of agricultural infrastructure built by someone who understood what the plant needed and had provided it without excess. The rice in the paddles was at late grain stage, the stalks bent with the weight of the seed heads. Ellen had stopped at the first paddle and looked at it for a long time. The plant was different from anything in her research experience. Not dramatically different. It was recognizably Zizania palustris, the northern wild rice species native to the Great Lakes region. But the morphology was distinct. The seed heads were more compact than the commercial varieties she knew. The grain was darker, almost black at full maturity, rather than the dark brown of cultivated stock. The plant height and the tiller pattern were different. She had taken out her field notebook and written, August 19, 2021, Gale property, Cass County. 4 cultivated paddles, Zizania palustris, morphologically distinct. Seed head compact, grain coloration dark, approaching black at maturity. Possible heirloom cultivar, source unknown, see owner. Nora Gale was 74 years old and had been growing the rice since 1983, which was the year her grandmother Agnes had died, and had left Nora the seeds in a coffee can on the kitchen shelf with a note that said, "These go in the water in May. Pick them in August. Save the best ones. Do not let them end." Agnes had grown the rice in a small paddle behind her house on the Leech Lake Reservation since the 1940s. Before Agnes, her mother Margaret had grown it. Before Margaret, it had been gathered from a specific lake bed in the Cass Lake area that the family had known about for generations, and that had, by the time Margaret was old enough to gather it herself, been so reduced by commercial harvest and by the introduction of commercial cultivars to the surrounding lake system that Margaret had begun the paddle cultivation to protect the seed stock from disappearance. The origin of the seed went back before Margaret's memory. Agnes had told Nora in one of the last conversations they had had before Agnes's health failed that the rice was old. Not old in the way that heirloom seeds were described as old in catalog language. Old in the way that the Ojibwe relationship with Monoman, wild rice, was old. Pre-contact old. The specific strain that the family had gathered and then cultivated was the strain that had grown in that specific lake bed for as long as anyone could remember, shaped by the water chemistry of that specific lake and the specific seasonal patterns of that specific place. Agnes had said, "This rice is not something we made. It is something we found and kept. And then we had to protect it from what happened to the lakes. What happened to the lakes was the commercial wild rice industry. The commercial wild rice industry in Minnesota had its origins in the 1950s and had expanded dramatically through the 1960s and 1970s as commercial cultivation in paddy systems had made the grain widely available and had driven down the price of the lake-harvested crop that Ojibwe families had relied on for centuries. The commercial cultivars, bred for high yield, uniform maturity, and mechanical harvestability, had displaced the native lake populations through competition and cross-pollination. By the 1980s, what was sold in grocery stores as Minnesota wild rice was primarily a commercial cultivar that bore a family resemblance to the native species, but was genetically distinct from the pre-commercial lake populations. The taste was different. The texture was different. Most people who bought it had never tasted the original and had no reference point for the comparison. Nora had the reference point. She had eaten Agnes's rice her whole life. She had also eaten the commercial product in restaurants and at other people's tables, and she had understood the difference from the first time she encountered it. The difference was not subtle to someone who knew what the original tasted like. It was the difference between something cultivated for mass production and something shaped by a specific ecosystem over a very long time, and carrying the specific character of that ecosystem in its flavor. Agnes had said, "This rice tastes like Cass Lake." She had meant it literally. Nora had grown the rice in Agnes's paddles for 4 years after Agnes died, and had then built her own paddles when she moved to the Leech Lake Road. 4 paddles in the low area behind the house, fed by the seasonal creek. She had been growing the rice in those paddles since 1987. 34 years by the time Ellen Marsh drove up from the Twin Cities. She had told almost no one. The reason she had told almost no one was the specific silence of a person who had something that required care and who understood that the care was best provided by keeping the number of people involved small. She had grown up watching what happened when something the Ojibwe had developed or maintained became known to outside institutions. The attention was not always harmful. It was rarely fully helpful. It came with frameworks and institutional interests that were not the same as the interests that had produced the thing being attended to. The rice had survived 40 years of commercial pressure by being in Agnes's paddles and then in Nora's paddles, kept by one family who understood what they had and why it mattered. She had talked to her daughter Clara about it once, in the early 2000s. Clara had said, "You should tell someone." Nora had said, "Who?" Clara had said, "The university, the tribe, someone who can protect it." Nora had said, "I am someone who can protect it. That's what I've been doing for 20 years. Clara had said, "But what happens when you can't?" Nora had looked at her. She had said, "Then you will." Clara had said, "I don't know how to grow rice." Nora had said, "I'll teach you." She had taught Clara over the following years, working the paddles together, reading the water, selecting the seed, learning what the plant said in different conditions. Clara had learned enough to continue it. Ellen Marsh showing up in August 2021 had been, in Nora's assessment, the right person at a possible right moment. A person who spent 20 minutes at a wild rice paddle before introducing themselves was a person who was paying attention to what they were looking at. She had made coffee and had answered Ellen's questions. The questions had been the right questions. Ellen had asked where the seed stock came from. Nora had said, "My grandmother." Ellen had asked about the lake bed. Nora had described the gathering, the change to the lake system in the 1960s and 1970s, the paddle cultivation that Margaret had begun. Ellen had been quiet for a long time. Ellen had said, "So this paddle cultivation is the only continuous line from that lake population?" Nora had said, "As far as I know, yes." Ellen had said, "Can I take samples?" Nora had said, "What will you do with them?" Ellen had described the genetic analysis, the university database, what she expected to find. She had said, "If what I think I'm looking at is what I think it is, the findings will be significant." Nora had said, "My grandmother knew it existed." Ellen had said, "Yes." She had said, "I mean significant to the research community." Nora had said, "I know what you mean." She had been quiet. She had said, "You can take samples, but I want to be involved in whatever comes from them. Not as a subject, as a partner." Ellen had said, "That's how it should work." Nora had looked at her. She had said, "Good. Come back tomorrow with your equipment." The genetic analysis had taken 4 months. Ellen had worked with the University of Minnesota's Plant Genetics Laboratory and with a researcher at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission who maintained a database of documented wild rice genetic samples. The results came back in December. The Gale paddle rice carried a genetic profile that matched, with high statistical confidence, a pre-commercial wild rice population documented in a 1971 survey of Cass Lake, conducted by a University of Minnesota limnologist named Dr. Paul Weir. Weir's survey had collected samples from 11 lake beds in the Cass Lake system and had noted significant variation between populations, evidence that the different lake beds had developed distinct local strains over long periods of isolated evolution. His 1978 follow-up had noted that the bed designated Lake Bed 7 appeared to have been lost through dilution with commercial cultivars. The strain had not been lost. It had been in Margaret's paddles, then Agnes's paddles, then Nora's paddles, for 50 years, in 4 hand-built waterbeds on the Leech Lake Road, kept by one family. Ellen had called Nora the day the results came in. She had said, "The rice in your paddles is the Lake Bed 7 strain from Paul Weir's 1971 survey. We've believed it was gone since 1978. It hasn't been gone. It's been in your paddles." Nora had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "My great-grandmother knew which bed. She knew it was the best rice. She took it before the lake changed." Ellen had said, "She saved it." Nora had said, "She grew it." There's a difference. Ellen had been quiet. She had said, "You're right, there is." The University of Minnesota's announcement had been published in February. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune ran a feature story with a photograph of Nora at the paddles in August light. The story described the discovery accurately. It missed, in Nora's view, the most important thing. The most important thing was not the genetics. The most important thing was the 80 years. Margaret had made a decision in the 1940s when she understood that the lake bed was changing. She had taken seed from the lake and built paddles and begun cultivation without institutional support or research partnerships or genetic analysis. She had made it because she understood that the rice was specific to that place and would not survive the changes coming to the lake system unless someone took responsibility for it. Agnes had continued what Margaret started. Nora had continued what Agnes started. Clara was continuing what Nora started. 4 women, 80 years, one decision made correctly in the 1940s and honored through everything that followed. The genetics confirmed what was true. The genetics were not why it was true. Clara had come from Duluth for the announcement week and had stayed for 2 weeks, working the paddles with Nora the way she had been working them for 20 years. She had asked Nora on the second evening whether the attention felt different now. Nora had said, "The paddles are the same paddles." Clara had said, "But everything around them is different." Nora had said, "Yes." She had said, "What worries me is the interest that comes from people who want to use the story without understanding the responsibility." Clara had said, "How do you stop that?" Nora had said, "You can't always stop it. You just keep the paddles what they are, and you stay responsible for what you're responsible for." Clara had looked at the paddles in the evening light. She had said, "Grandma Agnes would have said the same thing." Nora had said, "Agnes would have said, the rice doesn't care who knows about it. It cares who grows it." Clara had smiled. She had said, "That's right." Nora had said, "That's been 4 women for 80 years. It will be you for the next 40. She had looked at Clara. Clara had looked at the paddles. She had said, "All right." The paddles had been quiet in the last of the evening light, the water still, the harvested stalks standing in the late-season marsh, the seed of the next year's planting already in the coffee can on the kitchen shelf where Agnes's note had once been. These go in the water in May. Pick them in August. Save the best ones. Do not let them end. They had not ended. They would not end. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. Nora had learned to build the paddles from a man named Leonard Beauchamp, who was her mother's uncle, and who had been growing wild rice in paddles on his property near Ball Club since the 1960s. Leonard was not Nora's family's specific connection to the Cass Lake rice. That came through Agnes's line, but he was the practical knowledge source. Agnes had the seed and the understanding of what the rice was. Leonard had the engineering. Leonard's paddles had been built with a system of clay dikes and wooden control gates that he had developed through trial and error over a decade of seasonal failures and incremental successes. The dike walls needed to be compacted in a specific way to prevent seepage. The water depth needed to be managed precisely through the growing season, deeper in early spring when the seeds were germinating, shallower through the summer to allow the plants to reach light, specific management in the fall as the grain was maturing. The creek drainage needed to be managed so the paddles received cold water without being overwhelmed in high water years. Leonard had shown Nora all of this over 3 summers in the late 1970s, when Nora had been in her early 30s and had understood, watching Agnes slow down, that the paddle management would eventually pass to her. She had paid attention the way Agnes had taught her to pay attention, which was completely and without assuming she understood something until she had seen it several times in different conditions. Leonard had said at the end of the 3rd summer, "You know enough. You'll learn the rest from the paddles." Nora had said, "What do the paddles teach?" He had said, "What they need. You'll know it when you've been watching for a few years." She had said, "How many years?" He had said, "As many as it takes." He had not been vague. He had been accurate. The paddles did teach, in the specific way that things taught when you spent enough time paying attention to them. The signs of stress from too deep water in the wrong week. The way the plants responded to late cold. The specific moment in August when the grain was ready, which was not a calendar date, but a reading of the plant itself. Nora had been reading the paddles for 40 years. She read them with a completeness that she could not fully transmit to anyone else except by spending 40 years alongside them. She was transmitting what she could to Clara, who was getting it faster than Nora had gotten it from Leonard, because Clara had grown up visiting the paddles and had accumulated seasonal exposure since childhood. But there was no shortcut to the knowing. It accrued over time, the same way the seed accrued over time, in small increments, each season adding to what came before. The coffee can on the kitchen shelf was not Agnes's original can. Agnes's can had rusted through at the bottom in 1991, and Nora had transferred the seeds to a new can, the same size, the same position on the shelf. She had kept Agnes's note, the one that said, "These go in the water in May," in the new can, folded and tucked under the seeds, where it had been since 1991. The note was fragile now. Agnes had written it on a piece of paper bag in the specific way of a woman who wrote on whatever was available when something needed to be written down. The writing was in pencil, which had faded, but was still legible. Nora had memorized it 40 years ago and did not need to read it to know what it said. She kept it because it was Agnes's handwriting and Agnes's instruction, and the instruction had been correct. And the paper was the oldest thing in the house that connected the rice to the person who had most clearly understood what the rice required. Ellen had asked to photograph the note during one of her research visits. Nora had allowed it. The photograph was in the university's archive file for the Gale collection, alongside the genetic analysis results and Nora's recorded oral history, and photographs of the paddles in each of the 4 seasons. Nora had insisted on the oral history component, not because she thought the oral history was more important than the genetics, because she thought they were different kinds of truth and that both kinds needed to be in the record. The genetics said what the rice was, in the molecular sense that the scientific framework understood. The oral history said what the rice was in the sense that mattered to the people who had kept it. Not a specimen, not a data point, but a responsibility passed from hand to hand across generations by women who understood that the responsibility was specific and non-transferable and had to be actively maintained or it would end. The archive now had both. Ellen had understood why both were necessary. That was part of why Nora had continued to work with her. There had been a visit in the spring of 2022 from a wild rice cultivator in Clearwater County who had read the Star Tribune story and had driven 3 hours to ask Nora if she would sell seed stock. His name was Phil Hansen, and he ran a commercial wild rice operation on 40 acres and was interested in diversifying into heritage varieties that he could market at premium prices. He had been courteous and businesslike and had made what he described as a fair offer for a small seed quantity. Nora had said, "The rice is not for sale." Phil had said, "I understand wanting to protect the variety, but with the right cultivation approach," Nora had said, "the rice is not for sale." He had said, "I'm not talking about mass production. I'm talking about careful cultivation with full attribution." Nora had said, "I heard you. The rice is not for sale." He had left without the seed. Clara had been at the house for that visit and had asked afterward, should we have talked to him more? Nora had said, what would more talking have changed? Clara had said, maybe nothing. Nora had said, the rice is not ready to be in commercial cultivation. It has not been in commercial cultivation for 100 years, and going back into it now is not the right next step. She had said, the right next step is the university partnership and the commission documentation, and making sure the seed stock is archived. Then we see what comes after that. Clara had said, and if someone else develops a version from a different source? Nora had said, then they develop a version from a different source. She had said, what we have is what we have. It is specific to what we have kept and how we have kept it. A version from a different source is a different thing. Clara had said, you sound like Agnes. Nora had said, Agnes was right. Clara had said, yes. Ellen had brought a graduate student named James to the August 2022 harvest, which was the first harvest after the publication of the findings. James was 26 years old and was writing his dissertation on indigenous wild rice cultivation practices and their relationship to genetic preservation. He had spent 2 weeks at the paddles in August, working alongside Nora and Clara, learning the harvest technique. The harvest technique was specific. You did not strip the grain from the stalks by hand. You used a traditional canoe knock, adapted for the paddles, a flat wooden beater struck against the stalks, over the open water, the grain falling into the water and then collected in a fine mesh basket. The technique was low impact. It left a portion of the grain in the paddles as natural replanting. It disturbed the plants less than hand stripping. It was the technique that Margaret had developed for the paddle context from the lake harvest technique her mother had used. James had asked Nora, on the 3rd day of the harvest, why the technique mattered. She had said, because the rice has been harvested this way for a long time, and it grows expecting to be harvested this way. He had said, that sounds like an intuition rather than an observation. She had said, it is both. She had said, I have harvested this rice for 40 years with this technique, and the paddles have been healthy for 40 years. When I have deviated from the technique, she stopped. He had said, when you deviated? She had said, in 1999, I tried a mechanical approach for 1 paddle, 1 season. The germination in that paddle the following spring was 30% below normal. She had said, I went back to the traditional technique. He had said, Do you know why the mechanical approach affected germination? She had said, no. He had written this in his notebook. He had also written, Nora Gale does not claim to know what she does not know. She claims to know what 40 years of observation has taught her. She distinguishes between the two carefully. He had shown her this after he wrote it. She had said, that's accurate. He had said, it should be in the literature. She had said, write it in your dissertation. He had. It was in the published version in the acknowledgments, attributed to her directly. The coffee can with Agnes's seeds was still on the kitchen shelf. The seeds in the can were from the 2022 harvest, selected by Nora and Clara together in August. The best grain from the best plants of that year's season, dried on cheesecloth on the kitchen counter, the way Agnes had dried them and the way Margaret had dried them before Agnes. When Nora died, not yet, she was 74 and in reasonable health and had no particular plans. The can would go to Clara. Clara would select from it in May and put the seeds in the water and manage the paddles through the summer and harvest in August and select the best grain and put it in the can. She would do this until she could not, at which point she would teach whoever came after her the way Agnes had taught Nora and Nora had taught Clara. The chain required someone to hold it. It had always required someone to hold it. The people who had held it, Margaret, Agnes, Nora, and now Clara learning, were people who understood that the holding was the thing. Not the genetics, though the genetics mattered. Not the story, though the story mattered. Ellen had understood this by the end of the second year of the partnership. She had said to Nora at the end of the 2022 harvest season, I have been studying wetland genetics for 17 years, and I have never understood genetic preservation the way I understand it now. Nora had said, what do you understand now? She had said that the genetics are what you find when you look at what someone has been holding. The holding is prior to the genetics. Nora had looked at her. She had said, yes. She had said, that is exactly right. Agnes had held it for 40 years. Nora had held it for 40 more. The rice was what it was because of the holding. The genetics confirmed the holding. The holding did not require the genetics to be what it was. The coffee can was on the shelf. The paddles were in the low area behind the house. The creek ran clear and cold off the ridge. In May, the seeds would go in the water. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. Paul Weir had been a limnologist at the University of Minnesota from 1962 until his retirement in 1989. He had spent his career studying the lake systems of northern Minnesota, the hydrology, the plant communities, the ecological relationships that made the lake country what it was. He had died in 2004 at 81, and the paper he had written about the 1971 Cass Lake Survey had been in the university's archive, unread by anyone in the wild rice research community for 50 years. Ellen had found it in October 2021, a month after her first visit to Nora's paddles, searching the archive for documentation of pre-commercial wild rice populations in the Cass Lake system. She had found Weir's survey the way things were found in university archives, by knowing what to look for and being willing to look long enough. The survey was not indexed in the current database. It was in a physical folder in the Limnology Archive, labeled in Weir's handwriting, filed under Cass Lake System Surveys 1970 to 1978. She had read the 1971 survey and had found the Lakebed 7 description. She had read the 1978 follow-up and had found his notation that the bed appeared lost. She had then driven back to Cass County and had called Nora. Nora had asked, who is Paul Weir? Ellen had said, a limnologist who surveyed the Cass Lake rice beds in 1971. He documented the specific strain that your family was growing. He thought it was lost after 1978. Nora had been quiet. She had said he came to the lake and looked at the rice. Ellen had said he took samples and wrote descriptions. He knew it was distinct. Nora had said, but he didn't know anyone was protecting it. Ellen had said, no, he just documented that it existed, and then that it appeared to be gone. Nora had been quiet for a longer time. She had said, "My great-grandmother took the seed to the paddles before 1971, before his survey." Ellen had said, "Yes." Nora had said, "So he was documenting a lake population that was already in the paddles. He just didn't know about the paddles." Ellen had said, "That's right." Nora then said, "So the research said it was gone, but it wasn't gone, because the research didn't know where to look." Ellen had said, "Yes." Nora had said, "And the reason the research didn't know where to look is that my family didn't tell the research where to look." Ellen had said, "Yes." Nora had been quiet again. She had said, "We protected it by not saying anything." Ellen had said, "In a way, yes." Nora had said, "And now we're saying something because the time is right." Ellen had said, "Is the time right?" Nora had said, "The archive matters now. The documentation matters now. The partnership matters now." She had said, "It wasn't right in 1978, and it wasn't right in 2001. It might be right now." She had said, "We'll see." The question of what came next had been the subject of several conversations between Nora and the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission's Wild Rice Program Coordinator, a woman named Sandra Descharles, who had been working on wild rice preservation issues for the Commission for 12 years. Sandra had visited the paddles in September 2021, 6 weeks after Ellen's first visit. She had walked the paddles and had tasted the rice and had been quiet for a long time. She had said, "Nora, this is the old rice." Nora had said, "Yes." Sandra had said, "Where did Agnes get it?" Nora had told her about Margaret and the Cass Lake gathering and the paddle cultivation. Sandra had nodded through all of it. She had said, "My grandmother talked about this rice. She said there was a specific bed in the Cass Lake area that produced rice that tasted different from everything else. We thought that bed was gone." Nora had said, "The bed is gone. The rice is here." Sandra had looked at the paddles. She had said, "What do you need?" Nora had said, "I need the documentation to be right, and I need the seed stock to be in more than one place." Sandra had said, "We have a seed bank." Nora had said, "I know." She had said, "I want samples there. I want Ellen's University archive. I want the oral history recorded. And I want the management of the paddles to stay with my family for as long as my family can manage it." Sandra had said, "All of that is reasonable." Nora had said, "I know it's reasonable. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what the arrangement is." Sandra had looked at her. She had said, "Understood." Nora had said, "Good." The arrangement had been formalized in a memorandum of understanding signed in the spring of 2022 between Nora, the university, and the Commission. The memorandum documented the Gale family's primary custodianship of the living cultivation, the university's role in genetic archiving and research, and the Commission's role in seed banking and tribal coordination. It was the first formal documentation of an arrangement that had been informal and entirely adequate in its informality for 80 years. Nora had signed the memorandum at the kitchen table with a pen Clara had brought from Duluth. She had looked at it for a moment after signing. She had said, "Agnes would have found this funny." Clara had said, "Why?" Nora had said, "Because Agnes kept this rice by not signing anything. 3 people in a memorandum of understanding was not Agnes's approach." Clara had said, "But you think it's right now?" Nora had said, "It's right now because the landscape is different. In Agnes's time, a memorandum of understanding would have been something used against the rice, not for it. Now it's something used for it." She had said, "You read the landscape and you use the tools that are right for the landscape." She had said, "The rice is the same rice. The tools change." Nora had told the Star Tribune reporter, when asked what she wanted people to understand about the story, that there were 2 things. The first was that the rice had survived not because of preservation programs or genetic archives or institutional attention. It had survived because Margaret had made a decision in the 1940s to take the responsibility for it, and Agnes had continued that decision. and Nora had continued it, and Clara was continuing it. She had said, "The institutional work is valuable now." It wasn't available then. What was available then was one woman who understood what was being lost and decided not to let it be lost. She had said, "That's the story, not the genetics, not the university." Margaret in the 1940s deciding that this rice was worth protecting. The second thing was harder to say, in a way that newspaper readers would fully understand. But she had tried. She had said, "Monomen is not a crop, it is a relative." The Ojibwe relationship with wild rice is not the relationship of a farmer to a commodity. It is a relationship of mutual responsibility. She had said we took the responsibility seriously. That is why the rice is here. She had said the word is gizaba, to move quickly, to be in motion. The rice moves, it changes, it responds to the water and the season and the people who care for it. You cannot preserve it by putting it in a jar and leaving it alone. You preserve it by being in relationship with it. That relationship is what my great-grandmother maintained, and what we have maintained after her. The reporter had written this down. It was in the story. Nora had thought it was close enough to what she meant, which was better than most of what ended up in newspapers about things she cared about. The paddles had been quiet all winter. In April, the water would begin to warm. In May, the seeds from the coffee can on the kitchen shelf would go into the water. They had always gone into the water in May. They would go into the water again. The chain held. The rice moved. The responsibility continued. That was the whole of it. Margaret had been 17 years old the first time she went to the lake bed with her mother, Josephine. That was in 1931, which was not a good year for anything in northern Minnesota. The Depression had reached the lake country by then, and the price of everything that could be sold had dropped, and the price of wild rice had dropped with it. But the family had not been harvesting monomen primarily to sell it. They harvested it to eat and to trade and to fulfill the obligations of the harvest that had been part of the family's seasonal life as long as anyone could account for. The specific bed that the family had harvested was known in the family as the good bed. Not a name exactly, a designation that distinguished it from other beds in the lake system. The good bed produced rice that was darker and more flavorful than the rice from the other beds in the Cass Lake area, and it had produced this rice for as long as anyone in the family could remember, which went back at least to Josephine's mother, and likely further. The family did not know why the good bed produced better rice than the others. They knew that it did, and they had been returning to it every August for generations. Margaret had been at the good bed for 9 harvests when the commercial operations had begun changing the lake system. She had watched what happened, the introduction of commercial cultivars into adjacent growing areas, the shifts in water management that accompanied the commercial operations, the gradual change in the lake bed's character as the isolation that had produced its specific rice was disrupted. By the time she was in her late 30s, in the late 1940s, she understood that the bed was not going to survive in its previous form. The rice it produced was already different from what she had harvested as a girl. Not gone, different, moving towards something that was not what it had been. She had taken seed from 2 harvests in the late 1940s and had begun the paddle cultivation. Not as an emergency measure. She had been thinking about it for several years before she built the first paddle. As a deliberate decision that the specific rice from the good bed needed to be maintained in a controlled environment where the commercial contamination could not reach it. She had built the paddle on the north side of the house where the light was right and the drainage was right, and she had put the seed in the water in May of 1949 and had waited. The rice from that first paddle harvest had been what she remembered from the good bed in 1931. That was when she had known the decision was right. She had told Agnes about the paddle when Agnes was old enough to understand what it was and why it existed. She had said, The lake bed is gone. The rice is here. She had said, your job is to grow it and to teach whoever comes after you to grow it. She had said, this is not a choice. This is what we do. Agnes had done what Margaret said. She had grown the rice for 40 years and had taught Nora to grow it and had left Nora the seeds and the note and the instruction. Nora had grown it for 40 more years and had taught Clara to grow it. The instruction had moved forward unchanged. Grow it, select the best, put the seed away for next year, do not let it end. Nora had been 6 years old the first time she helped Agnes with the harvest. She had not understood what the rice was at 6. She had understood that helping Agnes was what you did in August. The same way helping Agnes with the garden was what you did in June and July. The specificity of the rice, its age, its origin, the decisions that had been made to protect it, came to her gradually over the years of helping, and then over the years of being responsible for it herself. Agnes had told her the full story of the good bed when Nora was in her early 20s, old enough to understand the technical and historical context. But she had been transmitting the knowledge for years before that in the practical way, the way of showing rather than telling, of working alongside and paying attention, of learning by doing the same thing in the same way, in the same season year after year, until it was in the hands. The first thing Agnes had taught her about the rice was how to read the grain. Not by calendar, by the grain itself. The commercial harvest guidelines said to harvest when the grain would release from the stalk with a gentle pressure, which was a standard agronomic test. Agnes did not use that test. She tasted the grain. A single grain from a representative plant, chewed slowly, tasted for the specific combination of nuttiness and sweetness and slight bitterness that indicated the grain was at its peak. Not the peak of yield, the peak of flavor. The two were not the same. Agnes had said, the grain knows when it's ready. You have to know how to ask it. Nora had asked, how do you learn to ask? Agnes had said, you taste it every year and you remember what the right taste was. And you taste it again when you think it might be time, and you decide. She had said, it takes about 10 years to really know. Nora had said, 10 years. Agnes had said, yes. She had said, I have been tasting this rice for 40 years, and I still sometimes wonder if I'm reading it right. She had said, that's what attentiveness looks like. You never stop wondering. Nora had spent 40 years tasting the grain in August and wondering if she was reading it right. She had been right most years. She had been wrong a few times. The years she had been wrong, harvested a few days too early or waited a few days too long, she had noted in a small log she kept on the shelf beside the coffee can. Not to castigate herself, to remember. The log went back to 1987 and had 34 years of entries, and was the second piece of written documentation, after Agnes's note, that connected the current rice to its history. Ellen had photographed the log. It was in the university archive, alongside the note. The summer before Ellen's first visit had been a difficult summer in the Paddos. A late June cold snap had stressed the young plants at a vulnerable stage, and Nora had spent 3 weeks in early July managing water temperature by adjusting the gate timing to bring more creek water through in the afternoons when the cold air came off the ridge. It had worked. The plants had recovered. The August harvest had been below average in yield, but above average in grain quality. The stress of the difficult June had produced grain that was denser and more flavorful than an easy season's rice, the way stress often concentrated flavor in food plants. Clara had been there for the difficult stretch of July and had helped with the gate adjustments, learning from watching Nora make decisions that Nora made partly by reading the plants and partly by reading the creek and partly by reading something she could not fully articulate, except by saying she had been doing this for a long time and she knew what the paddles needed. Clara had asked, how do you know when to adjust the gates? Nora had said, The plants tell you. Clara had said, "What does that mean technically?" Nora had said, "It means I look at the plants in the morning, and I look at the sky, and I look at the creek, and I put those three things together, and I make a decision." She had said, "I have been making that decision for 30 years. The first 10 years, I made it wrong fairly often. The next 20 years, I made it wrong less often. This year, I will probably be right most of the time." Clara had said, "And the year after that?" Nora had said, "Even more often." She had said, "It doesn't end. You keep learning." Clara had said, "That's not a reassuring answer." Nora had said, "No." She had said, "But it's the accurate one." The difficult summer had been, in retrospect, a good thing for Clara's education. A summer where everything went smoothly taught the mechanics. A summer where things went wrong and you had to respond taught the judgment. Clara had seen judgment being applied under pressure and had understood that the judgment came from somewhere that courses and books could approach but not fully deliver. It came from years of paying attention to these specific paddles in this specific place with this specific rice. That was what Nora had and what Clara was accumulating. It could not be transferred in a season. It accrued. Ellen had stayed for dinner on her first visit. Nora had made wild rice soup, the rice from the paddles, obviously, with vegetables from the garden, and broth made from the chicken she kept for this purpose. Ellen had tasted it without comment and had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "I have been eating wild rice my whole life. I grew up in Minnesota. I thought I knew what it tasted like." Nora had said, "What does it taste like?" Ellen had said, "Not like this." She had said, "This is something else." Nora had said, "This is the lake." Ellen had looked at her. She had said, "The Cass Lake bed?" Nora had said, "That's where the rice came from. It still tastes like that water. That specific water, the chemistry of that specific lake bed." She had said, "You can't separate the flavor from the origin. The origin is in the flavor." Ellen had been quiet. She had said, "I've read papers about place-specific flavor characteristics in food plants. I've never tasted it this clearly." Nora had said, "You've been tasting commercial cultivars. They were bred for everything except flavor." She had said, "Flavor wasn't the goal. Yield was the goal. The flavor went with whatever was sacrificed for yield." Ellen had finished her bowl. She had said, "Can I have more?" She had given her more, and they had sat at the kitchen table in the August evening and talked about the rice and the lake and Margaret and Agnes and what the paddles required and what came next. It was the first full conversation Nora had had with someone from outside the family about the rice. It was different from what she had expected. She had expected institutional questions. What is the yield? What are the genetic markers? What is the documentation status? Those questions had come, but not first. Ellen had asked about the taste first, and the origin first, and what the rice meant to the people who had grown it. Those were the right questions to ask first. Nora had decided, over that bowl of soup and the conversation that accompanied it, that Ellen was the right partner. Not a perfect partner. She came with institutional frameworks that were not always aligned with what the rice needed. But a partner who was paying attention in the right direction. That was enough to start with. She had said, at the end of the evening, "Come back tomorrow with your equipment." Ellen had said, "Yes." She had said, "Thank you for the soup." Nora had said, "Thank you for tasting it carefully."